This week on Rebuilders, we are looking at a rather complex topic.
Yeah. We're finishing out our neoliberalism series by looking at what's happened since October 7th in Israel and Gaza, and what this means for the global order, and what this means for the culture, and, you know, understanding what is the lay of the land in this conflict. And so I'll be setting that out for you today.
All right, let's get into it. Hi, welcome to Rebuilders. My name's Liddy and I'm here with Daniel and Mark. How are you both?
Good. We're a bit tired, aren't we? We haven't had the podcast for a few weeks. I was on break last week, and we've had our 24/7 prayer national gathering we were all part of. And
yes.
Lots happening. So apologies we haven't been around. Not that we should apologise.
No, but, you know, acknowledge it.
Acknowledge.
Yep.
No apology, but an acknowledging.
It was great to meet some listeners at the national gathering. Thank you for coming up and saying hi.
Yeah.
I feel like, you often get to do that with travel and stuff. So, I think both Daniel and I had the joy of being able to do that as well, which we're really grateful for.
Yeah. And it's always like, it's super encouraging, because the reality is it's three of us here in this studio kind of sharing thoughts, and but just to hear the way that that's actually really landing and helping shape people's perspective and ministries and what to be praying for and all these type of things. It spurs me on.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I mentioned this the other week too. Like I can't remember apologies if I'm repeating myself. Lots of apologies today. But I did an event for some Czech leaders too here in Melbourne and met some Czech Republic listeners as well. So hello to everyone all over the place.
Yeah, all over the place. And I guess thanks to God for how he is using us, and may we continue to walk in his way in this.
Amen.
So today, as always, there's a lot happening in the world, and one significant thing that we are going to focus on today, obviously the conflict occurring in the Middle East between Israel and how do I don't know how to say that. And Hamas.
Yes.
Should I say that?
Well, we'll get into the details.
So obviously on this podcast we've been talking about compounding crises in the world, and grey zone, the nature of grey zone. And this is a real, I guess, coming together of all of that. Another example of what is really occurring in the world, like geopolitically. So how about Mark? Can you kick us off with a bit of an overview?
Yeah. Well, I just want to say, to frame this in a particular way, I think we have been sort of exploring neoliberalism, which effectively is a word of the economic and I think political order that, we've been in, for the last 20 or 30 years. And, there's a great book called The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, whose author has temporarily, I've forgotten, Daniel will find. But he talks about, when there is a dominant political order, everything is shaped by it. And even those ideologies and other ways of doing things which are different from it still have to react to it, and I think we're coming to the end of the sort of neoliberal orders as we've understood it, and we're moving into this grey zone. So I think that's the framework we're going to look at what we're doing today. It's interesting too because speaking about Israel, speaking about Palestine, speaking about this issue inevitably is a hugely controversial issue.
Yeah.
And, what we're seeing, and we'll talk about this, is that however you talk about it, the facts are disputed and it's contentious and it's conflicted. And, very much if you look at how this is playing out on the ground and there's an actual battle and people have lost their lives and, there's tremendous suffering and tragedy. But I just also want to say what's interesting is we have just had what could be called an ethnic cleansing in the enclave called Nagorno-Karabakh, which is an Armenian enclave, and Azerbaijan effectively moved hundreds of thousands of people out, Armenian people out of that enclave, and virtually no mention in the global media. Wow. We also have a significant war in Sudan. Again, thousands of people killed. You have many of the world's superpowers at play there. Interesting, a report came out that even Ukrainian special forces have been spotted sniping against Russian Wagner mercenaries in Sudan in Africa, connected to oil and gold, and tremendous suffering, but rarely mentioned.
Yeah.
Pakistan, which has had a large Afghan refugee population come into Pakistan, has just given the order for, I think, 1.6 million Afghans to leave the country and go back to Afghanistan. A huge removal of a refugee population. Again, no mention of it barely in the international media. So one thing that, I say all that for a particular reason, that there is something about this conflict which links into other things. And in some ways it has deep symbolism and idealism for religious and political reasons, which is why we're talking about it. And that, rather than Sudan, is what's happening in Armenia and Azerbaijan, or in the Sahel with various African republics which have had various coups. So there's something about this which is deeply resonant in the world. And there's so much we could talk about. We could talk about this for hours, but just to give you an overview, effectively, the reason we're here is that on October the 7th, Hamas, which is the authority but also militant terrorist organization which controls Gaza, launched a sort of stunning raid into Israel, which attacked some military installations, but also many civilians, and with horrifying sort of casualties of children. And I'm not going to go into the details. You can find them online, but just absolutely sort of barbaric attack against civilians. And I think it was around 1,400 civilians were killed in Israel. Israel then went into a period of shock. Israel was seen as one of the world's sort of most staunchly, observant militaries in terms of guarding those borders, and it was a shock that they actually got through in such a way. And also Israel's intelligence services, the Shin Bet and particularly the Mossad, are sort of lauded as the world's best, and the fact that this sort of just came out of the blue and they didn't detect it was incredible. Instantly, people knew that this was going to create a firestorm, because Israel was already being rocked by political scandal. The leader of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, had significant protests against him around the legitimacy of his rule, and he's been in power for some time. But he'd increasingly began to sort of seek alliances with further right elements within the political establishment in Israel, particularly on the sort of ultra-Orthodox right. So you'd seen this very similar to what you'd seen in America, this protest movement and, different courts ruling, and this was ongoing. So you had already destabilized Israel entering into this, and a sense that Israel was wounded, that it was going to have to respond. And we've seen that response militarily into, as of recording, it's been really a campaign of bombing and then some sort of incursions into Gaza, the Gaza Strip, which is where many Palestinians live. And as yet we're to see a ground invasion and taking over of the Gaza Strip, and many people are predicting that is going to happen. So in some ways, that is the facts on the ground, but then they intersect with a whole bunch of other realities that are happening in the Middle East. In the Middle East, nothing's ever simple. It links into other realities. So we have seen that happen. So Hamas as an organization is supported by the Iranian Islamic Republic and the IRGC and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the military wing of the Iranian Republic, has spent a lot of money and a lot of time over the last decade building up a series of proxies, which is basically forces that fight on behalf. So Hamas is a proxy it's a Palestinian organization. It's Islamist. Traditionally, some of the Palestinian liberation organizations, such as the PLO and Fatah, were organizations that tended to be more political in their ideology, tended to be more based on political means. They had military wings, but they were more, in a sense, secular, for want of a better term. I say that loosely because of the Middle East and people were still religious. And they came out of the liberation sort of tradition that you sort of saw. So there was terrorist activity that occurred in the 1970s, 1960s, led by organizations like the PLO. But Hamas is an Islamist organization, so it comes from a radical Islamic perspective, which is more akin to Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or Daesh in their sort of ideology. So they're supported by Iran. But also what we have in Lebanon, when Israel was settled, you had Palestinians who were displaced move into Lebanon. And there has grown up what's called the Party of God, or Hezbollah as it's better known, which is a political organization. It's a social organization, but it's also a military proxy for Iran. And that has quite a significant fighting force. And so we're still seeing a low-level sort of military engagement between Israel and Hezbollah. It hasn't kicked off. But one of the real concerns is that Hezbollah is significantly bigger than Hamas. That if Israel then becomes engaged with Hezbollah, you've got basically engagement on two fronts, which in war is never good. To complicate things, you've also got other Iranian proxies. So a part of what is called the axis of resistance by the Iranians. So if you remember back, Donald Trump gave the orders to kill the Iranian commander, Soleimani, and he attacked him in a drone attack in Iraq. But what Soleimani had been doing is building up these proxies. And in one sense, they create a sort of land bridge from Iran all the way to the Mediterranean. But also, in a sense, they sort of surround Israel. So you have the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which is actually quite far. When you look at a map, there's Saudi Arabia, which is quite big in between Yemen and Israel, but the Houthi rebels are backed by Iran, and they've been firing missiles, not heaps, but they've fired some missiles towards Israel. And then you also in Iraq, where you have a Shia, so Islam is split into two sort of, there's subdivisions, but two sort of larger schools of Sunni and Shia of Islam, brands of Islam. And so you've got Shia-aligned, Iran is Shia, sort of Iranian-backed proxies in Iraq, and you also have them in Syria. So Israel is surrounded by Iranian proxies, and you have engagements that has already occurred. Now, what has also happened is that you have had engagements between the United States military in Iraq and Syria and Iranian proxies. So this is bubbling along. It's not at a high level of full-blown war, but where we are at the point is that, the US has moved significant assets as well as other NATO countries into the Mediterranean. So you're at this point where you're sort of pause where something bigger could happen. There's obviously a sort of strategic alliance between Iran and Russia. In the war in Ukraine, Iran has been supplying particular kinds of drones to the Russian forces. And there is this sort of out there, how strong is it? We don't exactly know, but some sort of alliance between China, Russia, and Iran as well, which is also has concern. Russia has, sort of equipped some of its fighters. Russia has been involved in Syria and has had a presence in the Middle East. And, they've equipped some of their fighters with aircraft carrying, destroying missiles. So where we are at a point geopolitically is that we're in a very, very dangerous position. And the sense that is if Israel fully goes into the Gaza Strip, that could trigger a regional war between the Iranian proxies. Also, obviously, you've got other countries like Saudi, UAE, Qatar, which houses a lot of the leadership of Hamas. Jordan is feeling some destabilization occurring. So you have a conflict, whereas the Ukraine conflict, you were surrounded by other nations like Poland and the Baltics and so on, which weren't as destabilized and had the potential for destabilization.
Yeah.
But the problem with this conflict is there's tremendous potential for destabilization around those countries. So the real concern is you have this initial action, which was terrible, and there's obviously this action happens in the whole tapestry of history, which goes back to the emergence of Zionism in Palestine at the end of the 19th century, when Theodor Herzl, who was really the sort of grandfather of the idea of Zionism, which is a political, social, and religious ideas, and there's different emphases with different people of the Jewish people returning to their homeland. I'll stop there before I go into a history of that. That's just a general overview of where we're at in terms of politically and militarily.
Thank you. That's a very helpful overview. Some stuff I didn't know or understand before, so that's really helpful. Before you mentioned that obviously this particular conflict is different to some of the other ones that are going on. In what other ways is it different? So
there is a resonance that this conflict has socially, politically, and religiously. In Jerusalem, you have very much the three Abrahamic religions have a stake in the ground. You have the Wailing Wall. Obviously, Jerusalem was, the biblical city of David and is where the temple was. And, you have the Wailing Wall, which is evidence of the temple, you also have the Al-Quds mosque, also the Al-Aqsa mosque, on the sort of Temple Mount, which is a really significant site in Islam. And you also have a Christian presence in Jerusalem as well. It's also very important to those sort of three religions. So anything around that piece of real estate has tremendous religion socially. There has been a sad history of at times Christian persecution of the Jewish people. One of the reasons that Zionism begins is because Jewish people experienced, and you go right back to the medieval period and so on. There were things, pogroms, but particularly in the 19th century, you go back to even Martin Luther. One of his last books was really a terrible sort of screed against the Jewish people, and Jewish people were banned at different times from certain professions. But if you fast forward to one period of anti-Semitism in Russia, in many ways, the sort of emergence of what we call fascism today, you could trace back to 19th century Russia, where you had, the groups like the Black Hundreds, and there were these groups which, in a sense, started these anti-Jewish pogroms, and Jews were killed, and it was quite a terrible time. And this took some Jewish people to begin to move back to Israel. There was already an existing Jewish community in Israel who lived alongside Muslims, who were the majority, but also Christians as well. There's other groups such as Druze. And in many ways, what was going on was that as the idea of nationalism took off in Europe, you had the collapse of empires. Empires were coming to their ends. And that was really sped up by World War I, with the collapse of many of the sort of empires losing their power, including the Ottoman Empire, which controlled a lot of the Middle East. But what was happening, Herder, who was a thinker, had really sort of had this idea of, almost against modernity. Modernity was seen as people who were placeless. Many of the cities in Europe weren't actually representative of the kinds of people we would associate with those nations now. So in a sense that cities were often places where you'd meet English people or German people or Jewish people, lots of trade and connection and connectivity, universities. And really this sort of thought, pushing back against modernity, which seemed rootless and based in sort of money, was this idea that, well, we need to discover what are our real roots, who are the indigenous people of these lands, what's their language, what's their folk tales, who are the Latvians, who are the real French people, had all these sort of different ideas. And this is how nationalism begins as sort of empire begins to fall. But part of the problem is that then people who sort of said, we're the people of this land, we're the people of this tongue, we're the people of this ethnic blood, started looking at the cities and saw people, and they looked at people like Jewish people and started casting them as, they're rootless, they're cosmopolitan, they're just involved in money. So Jewish people found themselves caught up in this critique of modernity. And you saw then, in some ways, a reaction to that as people moved back to Israel. But then also what you saw was some of those ideas sort of catch on in Zionism. Well, we need our own land. We need to rediscover the Hebrew tongue. Hebrew had in many ways sort of dropped out of use apart from in religious sort of environments. So you've got a large diaspora of Jewish people who obviously, whether have returned to Israel or not, are connected into the idea of Israel. You also have a large Palestinian diaspora all across the world, even in places like South America. So part of what we've seen in this is this then connects into those diaspora communities. You've seen that in Australia. You've seen Jewish Australian sort of, marches of support, and you've seen Palestine marches of support in some of our major cities. You've seen that in America, seen that in South America, you've seen that in Africa, Europe. But then also politically, this is one of the great sort of struggles, that in many ways the Western order has often aligned itself with Israel, particularly American politically has aligned itself with Israel. It hasn't always been an easy connection, but particularly one of the things that really, in a sense, moved the establishment of a Jewish state of Israel along was, the Holocaust. And so in 1949, the sort of Balfour Declaration, you have the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel, 1948, 1949. And so part of the West's struggle with itself is like, hang on, how did Germany, the land of, so much thinking and great composers and theologians and, of Goethe and, all these sort of people, how did it birth the Holocaust? So deeply connected to this question of Judaism as the minority in Europe. There's so much of critical theory and all this is this reflection on how did we, create the Holocaust, But then on the left, Palestine has been this long connected with story of oppression and the oppressed and the oppressor, many sort of liberation movements. So as empires collapsed and that continued on into the 20th century, you had that sort of movement of nationalism, also decolonization occur in the two-thirds world. And so there was an alliance as things happened in Algeria. You saw, sort of nationalism and decolonization happen in Africa, and sort of these revolutionary movements of the left, many inspired by sort of Mao's teaching on guerrilla warfare. And then, the reflected people like Frantz Fanon and these different people who looked at this sort of tradition in the left. Palestine became one of the key issues that people rallied around. So, for example, there was a terrorist group called the Japanese Red Army who came out of Japan, and they were Japanese radical left students who went to Palestine and said, use us, we'll be your terrorists. And there was the Lod Airport massacre, which the Japanese Red Army were the willing foot soldiers of the Palestinian issue. So that's why it's politically. So socially, politically, religiously, I don't want to use the word meme because it just seems so facile, but in a sense, it is like a meme in the truest sense of the word, in this that it's an image that then connects to all these other images that is used in all these different ways. So I don't mean that I'm just very careful in how I'm saying that, but I think people will get the nuance of what I'm meaning. So instantly what this has done is it just connects into so many of a culture war issues. So at a moment of culture war, it is Israel-Palestine is like one of the great culture war issues in the world. Everyone has an opinion on this. And also, sorry, I'd add one other thing for the Islamic world. This has been a real issue that is seen as Islam, which had its sort of ascendancy during the medieval period up to even sort of the 18th century, and then sort of seen as the West has sort of risen. Palestine has been a symbol of what is seen as the oppression of the Islamic world. So you've seen massive protests in Turkey and all these places, even though it gets a bit complex with Saudi Arabia and Iran. I won't get into that right now. Again, a very long answer, because it's a very complex issue of why,
one of the main things that you've kind of talked about there is it being such a significant culture war issue, and that's something that we've talked about time and again. In Grey Zone, and these escalating crises end up being these talking points and tension points in the culture. Do you? Like, where are we at with that? Where do we go from here?
Okay, so I was watching the American TV show The Circus the greatest political show on earth. And effectively, for those are listeners who have seen the show and those who haven't, I'll explain it. It's like a weekly sort of documentary show with a number of sort of people who follow what's going on in American politics. Mm-hmm. And I watched the episode. We get it in Australia about 24 hours after it screens in America on Showtime, I think it is. And it was interesting. They normally sort of wrap it on Friday and then you sort of can watch it on Monday is how it happens here. And they'd finished Friday and it was interesting that they had a pause in the series and they had their first episode back. And when they paused for the series, it was when Donald Trump had just been indicted. It was like, this is incredible. Donald Trump, a sitting president's been, a former president's been indicted, et cetera, et cetera. What's going to happen? And they return to the series and effectively they're like, there's these three terrible things happening. Number one, Donald Trump wasn't just indicted, he's been indicted multiple times. So, like that in a sense is this delegitimization of politics in America. Yeah. Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, had also sort of come with this charges been raised. So it's affecting both sides. This is their corruption. This is terrible. We're not used to seeing this in America. This is a disaster. And then the third element, which has since been resolved, but for numerous weeks there was no Speaker of the House. So like American politics is in dysfunction. So the end of this episode, they get this political historian in, and he's presidential historian in, and he's like, "This is the worst I've ever seen it. Like, will there be a republic? We're under so much pressure. This is a disaster." I'm watching this. And it's 48 hours after Palestine. After Hamas has come into Israel, and I'm like, watching it going, guys, this is going to get so much worse. So in a sense that this is a really difficult time for this to happen because the world is already feeling quite fragile, and we've talked about the cascading crises that we're part of. But it's not just happening. So in 1967, there was a number of the Arab nations attacked Israel. 1973, it also happened as well. And that then caused, an oil crisis, some of the stagnation. So some of the things we've been talking about, the political order of neoliberalism emerges in response to the economic effects of war in the Middle East in the 1970s. Yes. And so I sort of thought, wow, we're in the 1970s again. To be honest, I'm starting to realize I think we're almost at a 1930s moment just before World War II. Mm-hmm. And, you have, but what's happening too is that this is happening at a time of tremendous legitimacy crisis. And let me just explain that quickly. I am going to come back to your culture war. No,
it's fine.
Culture war answer. I'd mentioned American politics here. This is happening at a time where American politics is experiencing a legitimacy crisis significantly. Joe Biden, the Joe Biden's team, Axios, just did a report yesterday. They're like, Joe Biden's seemingly doing some good things. America hasn't fallen into recession. He's got Inflation Reduction Act. They're like, hang on, we're doing some good things here, but it's still a disaster. The polling is a disaster. You have the other potential candidate. Like it looked like a potential challenger to Donald Trump could emerge on the right, and there's some sort of more established Republicans are hoping that could be a Nikki Haley or a Ron DeSantis or something. It looks like Trump's got that rubbed up. Like Trump owns the Republican Party now is what it seems like. So you're looking at two very aging men, both incredibly unpopular, heading towards an election. And that's the sort of global superpower is where they're at in a legitimacy crisis. Mm-hmm. At the same time, you have the other global superpowers, Russia, in the midst of a war with Ukraine, Putin in a fragile position in some ways, China, which is the emerging global superpower. Xi Jinping is basically also experiencing this economic malaise. There is growing discontent at home. And I could go through all of the different leaders. Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom, Britain, another power, very unpopular, going to lose the next election. Macron, very unpopular, going to lose the next election. The EU, unpopular, in trouble. Like, you go across all of the players involved in this. Erdogan, who's just thrown his hat into the ring, record inflation, unpopular. So part of the danger at this moment is you have a lot of leaders. Iran, who's behind the axe. Some tremendous protests since the death of Mahsa Amini. Another young woman was killed with an engagement with the morality police for not wearing a veil. You've got a bunch of all the players are experiencing tremendous legitimacy crisis. Let me add another thing. This war we're seeing is at a moment when social media is having a legitimacy crisis and adding to the legitimacy crisis. Watching this war on Twitter, or now called X, and this is not a pro-Elon Musk or anti-Elon Musk comment, but the disinformation is unbelievable. So not only have you got disinformation coming out of the two camps, you've also got, I saw this, something like 2/3 of some of the disinformation coming out for pro-Israel is coming from India, because India and the BJP is aligned to Israel, and they want to support Israel because their Muslim majority is aligned to. So the networked effects of this conflict are simply unbelievable. Now, the other thing that's happened is we're also having a legitimacy crisis for the traditional American, let's call it the traditional neoconservative American political platform, which supports Israel, whatever, because there's people like the terrorist attack was terrible. But if Israel just goes in and flattens Gaza, it's going to create huge problems for legitimacy of America's sort of link to Israel. That's not me saying that point. That's me saying what some people are saying. Yeah. Right. So the traditional America always backing Israel, regardless of what, that has a legitimacy crisis. At the same time, those who are supporting this, the cause of Palestinian liberation, also have a legitimacy crisis because Hamas's actions were reprehensible, and there are people looking at Palestinians, advocates, and I'm not talking, this is again, not everyone, but that has a legitimacy crisis because there's people who are refusing to condemn Hamas's actions. So this is also happening at a time where we're going through this great moral resetting of the software.
Yeah.
So what you've seen, particularly in the culture war in the US, is one of the ways you could look at the culture war, not just in the US, but I'd say particularly the English-speaking world, but it bleeds out into the rest of the world, is we've moved from a liberal understanding, which is individual rights, not so much based on identity, sort of an equal playing field when it comes to free speech and law, to more of an intersectional critical theory approach, which is understanding that there is systemic injustice, systemic oppression, that they're the oppressed and the oppressor. How do we recognize those things? Because does the liberal vision mean that some people get unfairly, it's equity versus equality? Some people need lifting up. Both of those things are going through a legitimacy crisis in this. And particularly also, as you've seen, really since 2020, and a lot of American institutions began to bring in the software of intersectionality. And that sort of works when it's clearly like, men versus women or historical racial injustice in the US. But how does that work when you've got Israelis who see themselves as the indigenous people, who see themselves with a history of 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, who feel very vulnerable at this point of time, and who've just experienced this, what looks like an incredibly racially motivated terroristic attack of hatred. On the other side, you've got Palestinians who also see themselves as the indigenous people, who also see themselves as the oppressed people, who feel that they're experiencing a disproportionate attack that is affecting civilians and children are dying. How does that go through the intersectional system? And what you're seeing is this split. Yeah. So you're seeing some people who are like, I was on board with this, but the sort of diversity, equity, inclusion people now are starting to sound incredibly anti-Semitic. And you're seeing some outrageous stuff. So there is some outrageous examples of anti-Semitism occurring on US campuses. You've got universities, Ivy League universities in the US are refusing to condemn the actions of Hamas. And you've got then people who are liberals who are supporting them, many of them Jewish Americans, withdrawing their funds. So you're seeing this massive short-circuiting of the sort of new moral software that people were trying to put into the system because it's struggling to deal with the complexity and the nuance of the situation where it's not as simple as who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor. And you're seeing the culture war, in a sense, be short-circuited by this. It's making the culture war worse. It's globalizing the culture war. It's making this the prime issue, but it's also showing you the significant limitations and legitimacy crisis within the culture war.
It's a lot of stuff to process.
It is tremendous amount of stuff.
Very grey zone to me.
It is super grey zone. So, okay. Again, we could talk for hours, and again, too, I realize this is affects real people, and this is affecting real people now, and it has a real danger. So, I'll just say a couple of things on grey zone, and then I think I'll sort of move in a different direction. But I think that neoliberalism at the end of the day, and we've talked about this before, was the effective government letting the market do its magical thing, but also there was an element of management. In a sense, what we saw in neoliberalism was a sort of technocratic moving away from leadership to management, that effectively, if we just get everything in its right place, the world can just run along, the market will run things, government will support that, and we can manage our way through crises. You saw kind of with COVID, there was this sense of like, well, we can manage our way through this. And, we can deal with the issues of historic and systemic racism through just having the right programs, the right HR departments. We can deal with sexism by managing it in this particular way. And in a sense, the Ukraine war has been that, like trying to manage the Ukraine war by supplying Ukraine, trying to not to let it go beyond and become a bigger thing. We're trying to manage the economy. We're trying to manage the economy and try and like have a soft landing of bringing interest rates down so we don't head into a recession. We're trying to manage the environmental challenges that we have of net zero and all of these things. And we're trying to do this all in a particular way without affecting anyone really that too much, particularly in the West. I think this is the thing that is starting to trip things over. I don't know how you manage this. I mean, they're trying to manage at the moment. This doesn't go beyond this current rules of engagement. But the potential for this to spill into a regional war, we already saw a terrorist attack in Holland. It was Belgium. Okay, it was a Euro qualifier between I think it was Sweden and Belgium, where 2 Swedish fans were killed. Where a gentleman inspired by this. We've seen a killing of a Palestinian family in the US by someone who was angered about this. A young boy was killed there. So number one, the potential. I know the UK Terrorism Task Force Cobra met in the last 24 hours to talk about the potential of this. So we could see a new wave of terrorism, but then we could also see, as we talked about, spilling over into a regional war where you've got the real difficulty of the US trying to support Ukraine and Israel, the US possibly becoming more and more involved in this. If you go back to the Vietnam War, it never was like the US just rolled up and all the troops landed like it was D-Day. It was always some advisors came and then a few more troops and a few more troops. And so, you have the potential of this spilling over into something quite chaotic and complex. So I think what we're seeing is twofold. One is we're struggling to manage all these crises. And I think we've gone from, you look at US presidents trying to broker peace in the Middle East to now we're just trying to stop World War III.
Yeah. That's
where we're at. Secondly, what you're also seeing is you're seeing a definite split in the world. This has turbocharged the split in the world. When Ukraine happened, you saw the US try and get an international coalition, particularly around sanctions. George H. Bush in Gulf War I was able to get this big coalition, even of Muslim nations, to go and fight against Saddam. They're not able to do that anymore. You saw that many nations in the world weren't willing to go along with the war in Ukraine. That's even turbocharged now. The global South is very much looking at the West, and even the West is splitting on this. And you are seeing that in the UK Labour Party, in the Australian Labour Party, in the Democrats in the US, there's tremendous internal, even on the American sort of harder right, there's even a split of which way should we go. And so you're seeing the political order with America as the sole superpower in the world is moving to a much more multipolar world. That's one thing we're seeing. That is a significant shift away from neoliberalism, where you had America as the dominant sort of guarantor of global security, and then the world could just trade with each other and we're all heading to this happy place. I think this is the beginning of the end of that as we know it. So we're going to see a much more blocked world of blocks and coalitions, but it's also a far more destabilized world is what we're entering. So I think it's the end of that order.
Yeah, which we've been, I guess, sensing the tremors of for a long time.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the third front would be if something happens in the Pacific. There has been tensions between, or South China Sea, tensions between the Philippines and China. This is also happening. And the issue of Taiwan and the upcoming Taiwanese elections looms large in this as well. So we are definitely, this will have economic effects, just as 1973 it had. Like we're already seeing the price of oil go up. And we have numerous elections coming in Western countries, particularly in the US.
Yeah.
And just once, we just saw I think we also could see a significant destabilization of people moving out numerous of the Arab and Muslim nations around are saying we're not going to take any Palestinians. There was an Egyptian official which said we're not going to take them. Europe, you're into human rights. You can have them all. We saw how the further right was emboldened by the Syrian refugee crisis. This could be more refugees coming into Europe. So I think you already saw Europe swinging to the further reaches of the right. You're going to see that possibly accelerate. So this will change the political, economic, and I think it's changing the social order. This is one of those transformative events, just as Ukraine was, but I think this has the potential to be much bigger than Ukraine.
Mm. It's helpful to have all of those kind of contextual understandings. I wonder, I guess asking on behalf of listeners, what do we do with this?
Yeah. Well, I think that having background is really helpful.
Yeah.
And I think that partially what we're seeing is the binary, easy solution world that we've been sold, where, we just have to do the right things and tick box A and B and the world will slide to a utopia is being smashed. And I think that this drives us to prayer, and there is a real need to intercede for the world to not fall into a significant conflict here.
Yeah.
I'd say that first. Secondly, I think that partially what we're seeing in the cultural element of this is that, you have to pick a side, and the sort of simplistic frameworks of either good guys or bad guys or oppressed or oppressor, and I'm not making an argument here for moral equivalence. I just want to really make that clear that I'm not sort of saying the, actions of Hamas are equal to the actions of what Israel are doing in Gaza. I'm not even going to get into any of that. Like, I'm more saying that I think that, we need to pray for the innocents. We need to pray for leaders. We need to pray for nations. And the fleshly order of the world, which exists, we're seeing the effects of. There is the fleshly order pushes us to the tribal, to the confrontational, to feats of militaristic prowess and strength. It calls for revenge and bloodlust. And in the fleshly order, the oppressed can be tomorrow's oppressors. And that's not if you're hearing that just as a comment against Israel, it's not. That we're seeing the far-reaching and nuanced implications of sin in personal and systemic forms. And, so I think we need to really intercede and pray. So I would pray that war is contained. I'd pray for the innocents in this conflict. I would pray for diplomacy. There is a lot of diplomacy happening behind scenes. There would be meetings happening across the Middle East, across the world, that we need to pray to avert disaster. We need to pray for a solution. I've got to be honest, I have literally no idea what the solution is here. I can explain what's going on. I don't know what the solution is. But there is a church in Gaza. Yep. There's a church in Israel. There is a church in Iran. There is church in America. There is church in all these places. And I think we need to pray as the people of God, for the Prince of Peace to reign, even when we don't know what that looks like. I think there's a humility that I think what the Middle East does is it brings you to humility. Like when you read the books, and I've been reading, and I'm reading a book on Soleimani, I'm reading a book on history of Israel and Palestine. It is so darn complex. And I think there's a humility in the face of that. People just want to put a bumper sticker to say I'm on this side, or this is a simple solution. There isn't. The diplomats and people far smarter than us would have worked this out. But God is in control. God is moving history towards His ends. So I think it's a time to pray, even when we can't see clear solutions. I think that's really helpful. And I do hope that this brings some humility. I think hubris is part of what is falling with the last political order. And we're seeing the reality of sin. I think these returning things, I'm not surprised at the returningness of anti-Semitism. I'm not surprised that racism and violence and war and tribalism is still here, because we need heaven intersecting with earth, and we need good programs, and we need good initiatives. But humans, in of their own strength, even when we're trying to do justice just in the power of the flesh, will create more problems. And so, we need God in the midst of this, and we need to really, really pray and intercede. And history's filled with great men and women who were ordinary but prayed and interceded. And we may not see the effects of that, but I think now's the time for people to pray.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for helping us navigate a pretty complex space. There's obviously always more to say and more to explore, but I think what you've said has been really helpful. Daniel, was there any final questions from your side of the room?
Not a question. I did have just the passage come to mind that just, as you're talking about how do we pray, just the end part of Romans 8, just really stick out. I won't read it now, but if you do, any listeners want to read it, Romans 8, 18 to 27, 28, I think it's really good. Creation's groaning,
Yes,
present sufferings, spirit groans and intercedes.
and waits for the sons and daughters of Christ to emerge. And I think at these moments, that's where the sons and daughters of Christ emerge. And I just want to say, look, I'm sure there's things that we may have, this is such a contested issue that, knowing to talk about this, people say, but you didn't emphasize that point, you didn't emphasize that point. This whole thing is contested. And we're aware of that, and done this off the top of my head. But I think in the midst of it, what is uncontested is the call to pray. And evil will be vanquished from the world. It's going to happen. That's what we believe in. So we groan as the Holy Spirit intercedes in groaning when we don't have words.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next week.